It's been interesting experiencing Dracula through the ages, preparing for the newest remake of a 103-year-old film by reading the Bram Stoker novel and watching Nosferatu's 22 and 79 and Dracula's 31, 58, 79 and 92. I was startled to find that only the Christopher Lee Hammer horror version really came close to taking on the more recognizable cinematic horror trappings. And even that one bore more of a resemblance to a gothic romance, similar to Bela Lugosi and Frank Langella's versions, whereas both Nosferatus have a more stark, naturalistic terror to them, although even they do not deny the titular vampire his sensual side. But the Dracula character is allowed to take on a more directly romantic stance. The good looks of Lugosi, Lee, Langella, and Oldman, mixed with specific makeup and costume choices or the actor's own unique features or sensibilities, the Count is recognizably attractive and mysteriously alluring. His conventional beauty and unknown exoticism prove the perfect combination to make him irresistible to the women of the story, and therefore perceived as more of a real threat to the men. The Count Orlok type, with his permanently monstrous visage, is a more complicated story, framed more openly as a bringer of plague and suffering, opening the story up to the unnamed characters plunged into chaos, frenzy, and melancholy of a seemingly unstoppable epidemic. The Jonathan Harker, Van Helsing, and Arthur Holmwood characters, here called Thomas Hutter, Professor Bulwer, and Harding, are mostly rendered as helpless as the rest of the cursed town, with the Mina character, here called Ellen, not to mention Mina and Lucy's character frequently swap names for some confusing reason, taking centre stage with Orlok, assuming the responsibility of vanquishing him as it seemed to be her who drew him to the town. The connection between the two of them is therefore not just an erotic thrill, but also a reckoning with personal demons, a battle of guilt and rebellion set out by expectations of her as a woman, a wife, a Christian. A lot of this is extremely prominent in Coppola's Dracula too. The details of this struggle are brought about based on the nature of the Count's attraction to her. In 22, it's a distant craving. In 79, it's a yearning to have someone share his own anguish. In 92, Dracula is at his least selfish, and his desire is to allow her to break free of any constraints that deny her the most joy. In Robert Eggers' 2025 version, the most explicitly horror of all the versions I've seen, Orlok has been attracted to Ellen since she was a child, insists that she's been sending him signals so anything he did to her was her own fault, and more directly threatens her with torment and pain for her loved ones if she doesn't let him have her again. He's also more explicitly ugly and domineering in appearance. Plus he has a mustache. Read into that what you will. Hutter, Bulwer, now named Von Franz, and Harding have a lot of their storylines from the novel restored, giving them a greater share of focus and agency. The spread of the plague across the town cut down to focus more on Orlok's effect on them and their loved ones specifically, and Ellen's decision to sacrifice herself to stop Orlok is much more directly coded as something predestined. It's certainly interesting to see a Dracula adaptation finally go full horror, so to speak. But the more blatant depictions of Orlok as an outright monster feels like it makes the story more limiting, both in respect to the focus given to the characters and settings, and in respect to Ellen's decisions. All feelings seem to be painted more black and white, especially compared to the more freewheeling madness of Coppola's interpretation. All the same, it's an interesting experience to see all of Ellen's fears concerning her inner nature and deviation from expectation appear to her in so unambiguously evil and terrifying a manner. We live in time waged through key significant moments in the lives and relationship of Tobias and Almut. Most of the moments in time feel like pretty obvious choices. The first meeting, the first falling out, meeting the parents, getting pregnant, giving birth, competing in a European Chef Olympics final, the moments most couples go through at one point or another. The progress of their relationship through these moments seemed to be selected for the purpose of presenting one stage of life coming to an end for a new stage to begin. How these decisions often come at the precipice. Tobias's lowest moment of a marriage coming to an end as he drifts through life in a job that will do him just fine, but elicits no drive within him, is upended by a near-death experience that brings him together with Almut and gives him a new lease on life and love. This is mirrored at the end of the story for Almut, whose happiness with Tobias and her daughter nevertheless fills her with doubts about what kind of a mark she's truly made on the world, when terrible news sends her life flashing before her eyes. It's all pulled off pretty effectively by two of the most easily likable actors gliding through their scenes together. The main puzzler that perhaps dulls the emotion of the story really does seem to be the mosaic story structure, darting back and forth from one period of time to another without, and this is the important bit, any semblance of rhyme or reason, other than it lends more significance to the title We Live in Time and the general idea of life is made up of little moments. Pablo Larraín's latest in his 20th Century Women series, and allegedly last if it's being referred to as a trilogy is to be believed, takes something of a swing from the apparent format laid out by Jackie and Spencer. The quiet melancholy and intense drama is as prevalent as ever, but while a complicated relationship with a powerful man is still a subplot, Maria Callas's story is not framed as one of a woman reluctantly thrust into the spotlight like Jackie Kennedy, All Eyes on Her in the aftermath of an unfathomable tragedy, or Diana Spencer, the very boundaries of her life crumbling around her as the coldness of her marriage, in-laws, and status as a media figure send her spiraling. What's funny is that both these people were always well off. Not to undermine how harrowing being thrust into that level of scrutiny can be on anyone, but Jackie and Diana very much still came from that world. Angelina Jolie's Maria wears her fame with immense pride, a natural product of her talent, the kind of attitude that hints that she too is a product of a privileged upbringing, suggesting that her friendly relationship with her butler and housekeeper must only be surface level. Of course, anyone who knows Callas's life story better than I do won't have had to wait for the flashbacks to her childhood in Nazi-occupied Greece to realize how false this first impression is. I feel that power reveals is becoming a more and more popular counterpoint to the idea that power corrupts. And Maria is an interesting exploration of that. Her defiant standing in the winter years of her life as a one in a million talent, not a show of pomp, ignorance, or a prejudiced worldview, but her anchor point in a life controlled by others in her formative years. She will leave this world on her terms, something long denied her throughout most of her life. I often can't help but see a lot of biopics as being told from the perspective of the dying retracing their steps as their lives flash before their eyes. Maria embraces this concept as she imagines a young documentarian conducting a series of interviews with her about her life, framed as a symptom of her deteriorating health, but also clearly something she needs to distract her from fears that her star is fading. It's Maria's more tumultuous history, ambition, and the fears that connect the two that makes the film feel like it contains more of a rounded arc than Jackie and Spencer. But it wouldn't be a Lorraine biopic if it wasn't an ultimately doubtful, calmly chaotic rambling through a tragic life story. But it adds something to the feel of every meeting with Jeffrey Tate, liaison with Aristotle Onassis, and period of reflection in her apartment with Bruna and Ferruccio, namely a feeling of seemingly endless hurdles to achieving as sympathetic a goal as feeling fulfilled at the end of a tumultuous life. The onslaught of these scenes serve as a valuable reminder that the curtain call for one's life tragically never comes at a natural culmination of a journey you set for yourself. And the time you live after you've resolved everything you can often be just as tough as the trials you encountered in your journey. I wonder if it's entirely down to Jesse Eisenberg's writing and Kieran Culkin's performance, or if it's also a decisive statement on where I am in my own life at the moment, but this is the first time I can remember where I really have felt pretty much nothing but full support for the no filter, just telling it like it is character. The latter reason definitely is a factor, but I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the decisions of Eisenberg and Culkin. A character like Benji, particularly when paired with one as reserved as David, is usually designed to hammer home a much more life-affirming message centered around seizing the day and YOLO and so on. Usually in a way that's almost willfully ignorant of the world around them as they plead for the freedom to indulge in every impulse completely unchecked. But that is not Benji's desire. In fact, there's nobody in a real pain with more empathy and consideration for the people around him than Benji, even when he's being unbelievably short with them. There's no way to truly say you completely relate to a character's psyche when the kind of hypnomania they display is given no named diagnosis, although experiencing it from the outside like David does is pretty familiar. But the historical trauma and anxiety towards the present day and ordinary human interaction that it's coupled with is hauntingly relatable. What's especially fulfilling about A Real Pain is that Benji's awareness about how much is wrong with the world around him is never seen as a negative add-on to his mental state or dismissed as something that those of us who can't do anything about it should forget about or ignore. If we talked about what makes us sad more often, there might just be less to be sad about. And with all the positive reflection offered up by Benji's emotional swings throughout the narrative and the good that the trip to Poland does his and David's relationship, the thing that struck me as the most significant is that it offers no promise of overcoming the depression Benji confronts on a daily basis. As much as it doesn't sound positive, I do find it genuinely affirming that more films like this, and of all films, Barbie, choose to leave their audiences with the message that the uncompromising and uncomplicated happiness you remember feeling earlier in life probably isn't coming back. You know more and have seen more now, and living with that will often make you angrier and sadder than you would ideally want to be. And I find that affirming because the more open we are about that, the less alone people feel about it. There's an entire segment cut from this film between Nicole Kidman's confession to Antonio Banderas and his arrival at the summer home, where he wanders the city aimlessly in the middle of the night before infiltrating an orgy. Honestly, though, the most Babygirl reminded me of Eyes Wide Shut was in how much Kidman's character in this reminded me of Cruise's character in that film. Inasmuch as the confusion, submission, and fear were all feelings constructed by her in a moment of disillusionment with the assurances she felt with being so confidently in control. As the character of Esme put it, you'd expect it to be different with a woman in power. Except for that to be true, the means of acquiring power would have to be altered as well. Sexist and therefore male dominated, as so many workplaces still are, acquiring extortionate amounts of wealth, authority, and influence is achieved through a level of possessive greed that is not exclusive to any one kind of person. This as well, I think, explains why the role of Samuel went to Harris Dickinson, who, as many remarked, doesn't cast a particularly threatening or intimidating sexual energy. Not to mention that the husband Romy is supposedly unsatisfied with is played by Antonio Banderas. It all signals that Romy is the one fully in control of the danger at all times, fully aware of the risk and loving it. It's a desire stemmed from still being one of the few women at the top. All of the commercially viable feminist PR surrounding her image control doesn't drown out the knowledge that everyone at her level still thinks on some level that her work is ideally suited to men, and Romy is either an exception that proves the rule, or a token scapegoat that props up the illusion that the world is becoming a fairer place. But Romy is so good at succeeding, works so hard at being the best she can be, and so aware of the usual scandalous behaviour of men at her level, that of course the only abuse of power that's stimulatingly taboo enough is one in which she assumes the role so many silently assume she's meant to be in. The only tell that this is her game is that her choice of sexual partner is someone who hasn't and never will have any real hold over her. Basically, if the woman sat in the CEO's chair was Lydia Tarr, the affairs would be far less elaborate. It is refreshing entering one of these musical biopics with absolutely zero knowledge of the artist's life story, aside from some descriptions of Bob Dylan as someone who has redefined his musical output on multiple occasions, which is something very much at the centre of A Complete Unknown. I had a theory going into it that my ignorance of Dylan's life would help me to escape the typical tropes of the tried and tested Hollywood MB, especially as A Complete Unknown squares its focus on a particular period of Dylan's career, 1961 to 1965, rather than go all the way to the present day where Dylan is still recording music. There's no drug abuse focused third act, everything doesn't tie back to childhood trauma, and the last performance of the film is not framed as a definitive concert summarizing his whole life and career. Rather, it's the culmination of the themes of the film. Dylan's refusal to be put in a box, for there never to be such a thing as a definitive version of him, to always push for new ways to express his feelings and ideals. Sadly, all of that countercultural, contrarian expression only made the rigid structure of this film genre all the more apparent. Watching Chalamet and Norton put most of their effort into doing impressions of their real-world counterparts but keep the emotive tics as reserved as possible betrays the film's love for Dylan, Johnny Cash, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and so many more as being pretty surface level. It's like looking at silhouettes. The shape is recognizable, but the details are blacked out. A Complete Unknown respects Dylan as an advocate for civil rights, for the influence his peers and relationship had on his art. But the only way to lift these from being more than historical footnotes found in any summary of his life is to interrogate the finer details of what they meant to Bobby. Here he simply decides with a passive shrug that supporting the civil rights movement is probably the right thing to do. with the same assurance that colours his character from start to finish. From his arrival in New York to his notorious Newport Festival performance, Dylan just knows the course that he must take, and seemingly exactly how it will play out for him. The main source of pushback and conflict comes from his detractors and from the loved ones who, rather than confront him on his behaviour, accept that he is on an unalterable course and choose instead to leave him because they have gone from basking in his glow to being cast in his shadow. It's a decidedly messianic, predestined path for someone supposedly so determined to chart their own course. I don't know if it was the premise, the look of the film, or even just that it starred Mark Wahlberg, but until the day I saw Flight Risk, I was positive this was a new directorial outing from Peter Berg. Even the protagonists, being a yappy fugitive contained and transported by a retrieval expert with a mistake-ridden history, is a callback to Berg's best film. At any rate, I would never have predicted that this was Mel Gibson's latest return from a near decade-long directing hiatus. Sure, there's a larger debate to be had about the finer details of whether his filmography conveys a distinct style, but I think it can be largely agreed that a unifying attribute of Gibson's films is that the guy loves a grand epic, and excessive gore. So this boxed-in three-character thriller doesn't really feel his speed, and quite often you do get the feeling that he really wants off the plane. Not that there's any evidence that this wasn't simply in the script from the beginning, but the promise of a tense, close-quarters drama between Michelle Dockery's US Marshal, Mark Wahlberg's psycho hitman, and Topher Grace's detained informant gets put on the back burner for a lot of the runtime in favor of Dockery realizing she's got a satellite phone that can get them in touch with whoever they want. So not only do we quickly get in touch with Maz Ali's Hassan for flight instruction, we also get far more into the nitty-gritty of who the informant who hired Wahlberg is, uncovering the mole becoming the central plot point for some time, rather than dedicating that time to interactions between the three we're actually spending the runtime with. So there's never really any compromise of the trio's temperament and goals. Grace remains dedicated to testifying against a cartel boss in court because it remains the option that serves his best interest, inasmuch as he might not get killed. Dockery's troubled past amounts to a professional error in judgment, so her image as a straight-laced dedicated agent of justice is never discoloured, and Wahlberg rants about his love of killing, refusing payment and insisting that he gets off on the threat of death and the promise of torture and sexual assault. You've got your standard lawful good, true neutral, and chaotic evil archetypes, and they never stray. Which I suppose is somewhat in keeping for Gibson, actually. Whatever else is going on in the story, his protagonists stay the course of the goals they set themselves from the get-go. Be they a pacifist army medic, an imprisoned hunter looking to return home to his family, or, Jesus Christ, external obstacles are what Gibson uses to give his heroes conflict. It's simply a shame then that he didn't seem to realise that all the conflict he needed was already on the plane. At first glance, Presence's big, subversive trick is to basically take the most interesting aspect of the first Friday the 13th and go all the way with it. Just instead of a slasher film with a serial killer, we're watching a haunted house film, the entirety of which is seen from the perspective of the ghost. What's risky about this choice is pretty much immediately apparent. Supernatural or not, a lot of tension and payoff in horror comes from the fact that you don't know where the threat is when you're watching something from the vantage point of the protagonist, putting you firmly in their shoes. So if you always know where the ghost is, won't it kill the tension? Of course, this is where it pays to be as confident a tinkerer as Steven Soderbergh. The trick he's playing here is a great example of Hitchcock's famous analogy on building tension. Set up a scene where a bunch of characters are talking and tell the audience that there's a bomb under the table. The mere fact that we know something the family living in the house doesn't, as we all but fully take on the role of this invisible spectre stalking their every movement, is a pretty consistently resourceful well of tension. So on a technical level, the POV scenes are more purposeful and less gimmicky than, say, any film trying to appear like a single unbroken oneer. Each individual scene features no cuts, but the limitation set by being entirely set in the house makes for handsome and structured blocking and pacing through each scene, and adds to the atmosphere as the perspective we're watching everything through is shown to be an unblinking and omnipresent figure. Incidentally, when I finally see Robert Zemeckis' here, I feel this will make for a fascinating point of comparison. But there's a purpose for this stylistic choice in the story too. When it comes to ghost stories, or indeed any horror centered around the supernatural, a regular turning point is the moment of acceptance. It's often up for debate whether the victims of hauntings or possessions or whatever else have exhausted all rational explanations before finally accepting the otherworldliness of their predicament. A lot of films feature an ensemble of characters, each of whom are a different level of believer. Some of them refuse to accept what's going on around them all the way through the film until it's too late. And there's certainly an argument to be made that there's a certain irony or perhaps even cynicism in using supernatural occurrences, often heavily steeped in religious iconography, to lecture someone on their inability to accept the evidence in front of them to come to a rational conclusion. Nevertheless, it's becoming more and more apparent that denial and anti-intellectualism are not reserved entirely for religious fundamentalists. Plenty of people are very good at presenting themselves as people of science and logic, only to prove that when faced with something they're not fully read up on, they'll gleefully cave to dogma of their choosing to avoid adjusting their pre-existing worldview. So it's also hard not to see ghost stories as one of the best vessels with which to confront this kind of intense rejection of consideration and adaptability. And with its play on perspective, Presence ramps this element up to 11 as well. Married couple Rebecca and Chris and their kids, Tyler and Chloe, make up the typical ghost story ensemble in that they're all at different levels of willingness to accept what's happening around them. Rebecca and Tyler the more cynical, and Chris and Chloe the more open. But as we watch the family interact through the ghost's eyes, we see pretty quickly that this is the standard across all topics of conversation and elements of their family life. Chloe is at the very center of the haunting, grief-stricken by the death of a close friend, not to mention troubled by the very similar death of another girl, and struggling to deal with this in a way that could be indicative of clinical depression. Her sensitive father, Chris, is willing to be as open as possible with her about getting all the help she needs to get her through this. Therapy, medication if required, but is pushed back at every suggestion by Rebecca, adamant that time is a natural healer and anything else only threatens to make more out of Chloe's emotional state than is really there. In fact, her determination to maintain an image of normalcy and success within her family is also blinding her to the doubts Chris is having about their marriage. All of her attention is directed to Tyler, who shows all signs of being the image of healthy and happy that they believe everyone should strive for. Straight-laced, physically fit, sociable with all the quote-unquote right people, Tyler has developed a very absolute ideology about people: who is good and who is bad, who deserves success and who deserves empathy. One thing that becomes gradually clear from all this is that we're also dealing with a classic who's the real monster dynamic here, as the acceptance or rejection of the presence becomes synonymous with the character's acceptance or rejection of ideas surrounding mental health and systemic cruelty and abuse. How long can any of us keep sweeping visible, persistent issues under the rug to maintain an illusion of control and happiness? And do the people who do that have it in them to change course before it's too late, for them and for those around them? I wound up enjoying going through all the major Dracula films in the build-up to Nosferatu so much, I thought it'd be nice to do the same with the other Universal classics. Fell at the first hurdle with Wolfman, unfortunately, assuming the 1941 film was the only other major version of this story, what with it just being based on the werewolf myth rather than a novel. Turns out Universal released another werewolf film 6 years earlier than that one. There's the 2010 Joe Johnston film, and American Werewolf in London probably count as well. At any rate, I'm sure it would have been genuinely interesting to pick apart the common and diverging themes of the werewolf legend in each installment, but the 1941 film will have to do. And one thing that stood out about that one from early on was how scarce the Wolfman's appearances actually are. Far more time is spent on the fear around the possibility of his appearance, both for Lon Chaney Jr. and the increasingly hysterical townsfolk. And when looking at it as a story both about fearing the other and fearing one's own latent nature, it makes sense that George Wagner maybe wanted to limit the extent of the carnage and mayhem caused by the creature, instead allowing the people to leap to their own conclusions the second their lives are disturbed. Lee Whannell's version shakes up the setting and premise, but looks to still address these themes, dialing back the number of characters to a single family isolated in the mountainous wilds of Oregon. Although we start by flashing back to Christopher Abbott's childhood, in the same mountains with his father, one of a scant number of hunters living up there, whose protectiveness of his son gets in the way of showing him any real level of affection. His belief that a hiker went missing in 1995 is roaming the land as a werewolf becoming an obsession that he has to eliminate for his son's safety, trying to enlist other hunters in the area by appealing to the safety of their children as well. One of the better, subtler choices is that the father's fear is stoked by an incident where he never actually gets a good look at what he believes is the werewolf. And while we'll obviously see wolfmen later on in the film, there's never actually a confirmation that the missing hiker was ever one of them. The hysterical fear of an evil monster attacking innocent children merely turned the parent into such a monster. This, incidentally, is one of the less subtle elements, given that Abbott's character just outright says it to his daughter, which of course is where the fear of one's own cruel and aggressive nature comes in, with Abbott fearing how like his father he is. Winnell gets these details out quickly. Unlike the 41 film, the wolf attacks kick off early. Taking place entirely in one night, there's no reference to moonlight or anything else triggering the metamorphosis, and the glimpses of daylight we get suggest that this may just be a permanent transformation. So once everything's set up, the majority of the film is basically a lengthy cat and mouse game, focusing on escape plans, wolf attacks, and some minor body horror as a new host begins to turn. So the decidedly blunt acknowledgement of the themes at the start of the film are pretty much all you get. The choices in the setup are peculiar, as we're introduced to Julia Garner and Matilda Firth playing Charlotte and Ginger, wife and daughter to Abbott's Blake. It's quickly established that Blake wants to be an entirely different father to Ginger than his father was to him. This is outwardly acknowledged in his move away from the isolation of Oregon to a bustling city, but also in his standing with the family. A choice has been made to contrast Sam Yeager's Grady, a tough, angry single father, by having the fully grown Blake divert from gender norms and be a stay-at-home dad. He says he's a writer between jobs, but they're definitely inferring that his top priority is taking care of Ginger, while Charlotte is the career-driven breadwinner, a point that's driven home by Ginger playfully putting lipstick on her dad. And it's implied that this status quo is tearing the family apart, Charlotte especially growing more estranged from Blake and especially Ginger. So the trip to Oregon back to Blake's roots is intended to fix what's broken in this family dynamic. That's how the setup of this film is framed, at least. The deviation from traditional standards is a negative for this family, and returning and resetting will be a positive influence on them. Charlotte's arc, if she has one, is to step up, protect, and all around be more of a mother to her daughter. With all that being said, a film's setup is by no means a statement on its conclusion. Blake's return home, jumping into the role of an active protector, and his transformation into a primal rage-filled monster is by no means framed as a positive development, and Charlotte's actions throughout the climax in defense of Ginger don't in any way box her character in. I guess without all the scenes that could have been included if they hadn't been so eager to get to the wolf stuff, spending a day or two acclimating into their new setting, meeting local characters, splitting the attacks up so that the characters can react to however many murders occur, it leaves the final shot feeling just a little too vague. We know on a physical level what the characters have lost, but what else has changed? I can't remember if I was more silently captivated by that upside down shot of the Statue of Liberty, or if I was simply biting my tongue to stop from sarcastically bellowing, "Oh, it's about the American dream." But I like to think I'm naturally not that cynical, and honestly, it was a stunning shot. As a matter of fact, it takes seeing a film like this on the big screen to make a layman like me really take stock, of the appreciable differences that come from shooting on film. And despite the fact that in this respect and many more ways, Brady Corbett is wearing the influence of Coppola, Leone, and Anderson on his sleeve, I'm always excited to see how a tried and tested concept is approached by a new vision. I'm also always on the lookout for good companion pieces, and though it will probably cause unintentional wails of despair from this film's biggest fans, I honestly think this and Megalopolis would be a really good double bill. And the clue to how the Brutalist takes a refreshing approach is right there in the title. Laszlo Toth's architectural vision is depicted with such verve and tragedy, a dream of asserting an image of inextinguishable permanence, contrasted with a worldview of doubt and futility. Laszlo and his family's greatest trials of pain and suffering are never shown on screen. The war and the Holocaust are firmly in their past when they arrive in America. But he can sense in everyone around him that the prejudice that sparked those monstrosities not only survived the war but are alive and well in their new home. And the very idea of finding anywhere where dignity and respect are given freely feels like an outlandish fantasy. And so all his hopes and passions are poured into his project, to build something that escapes definition and reinterpretation, and is as much a figure of the land as the mountains themselves, that it defies any desire to be moved or erased. It's a dream that is crushed many times over, mainly by the greed of his benefactors, the Lee Van Burens, the patriarch Harrison in particular, a harsh depiction of the ineptitude of wealth. By all parameters deemed to be worthy by Americans, Harrison is Laszlo's superior. He has practically full control of his life through finance alone. The very idea that the two of them are in competition in any way would be ludicrous due to the overwhelming advantages Harrison has. And yet the mere knowledge that Laszlo has something he doesn't, in this case creative talent, is maddening enough to him that he must either control or destroy him. His wife Erzsébet is a more sympathetic foil to his desires. Despite suffering greater physical harm than her husband throughout their hardships, her aspirations for a happy and fulfilling life directly oppose the all-consuming nature of Laszlo's project, as well as his broken acceptance of other people's attempts to sanitize and erase his history and identity. But most of all, the ambition itself is its own undoing. As beautiful as the concept and construction of Brutalist architecture is through Laszlo's eyes, its art for the sake of art proposal is as self-defeating as that phrase always is. The final notion that it is the destination, not the journey, is betrayed by the 3.5 hours that preceded it. By the fact that we know his desire to be a fixture that cannot be minimized or categorized is informed by a resentment built up from a history of being the victim of such inhuman treatment. The details of an individual life may fade with the passing of time, but their voices carry an echo through in anything they create, and their history with it. A statement to the contrary is its own act of erasure. Thank you very much for watching. Please, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like it. If you'd like to see more like them, please feel free to subscribe. If you have your own thoughts on anything commented on the video or just the films in general, please do leave a comment. You can expect the next video in the first week of March, covering all the films I saw this month, providing that my optimism about my increased productivity is not misplaced. At the very least, I'm not aiming to be in the second week of the following month before I get it out. That seems like a realistic goal to set. In the meantime, though, another big thank you and wishing you all the best.